No one could predict the level of destruction Hurricane Katrina would cause. The Louisiana National Guard and the Recovery School District both suffered significant damage to their facilities located in New Orleans. Jackson Barracks, a historic garrison complex dating to the early 1800s, and the Louisiana Guard's headquarters, was devastated. Only when immediate life-saving and critical recovery operations had been completed could Adjutant General Bennett Landreneau and his team begin to take stock of the condition of his headquarters.
So there was a lot of thinking done at a strategic level to make sure that we continued to be an operational, have the operational capabilities to respond to the citizens of Louisiana, respond to the governor.
Initially, the Guard would be forced to divide their headquarters, leaving only a small attachment at Jackson Barracks.
And we looked at, of course, the decision of will we come back to Jackson Barracks, because we had such devastation.
A strategy quickly emerged not only to restore operational readiness to the Guard, but to bring Jackson Barracks back as well.
By making that decision to bring Jackson Barracks back as the headquarters for the Louisiana National Guard, helped a lot of citizens make the decision that they wanted to return to their communities and rebuild. I credit Colonel Doug Mouton for sitting down with me and talking about the vision for Jackson Barracks. He recommended developing a master plan so that as we looked at rebuilding Jackson Barracks, that we did it right.
The Recovery School District faced the overwhelming task of what to do about more than 100 school buildings that were destroyed or badly damaged by Katrina.
When Paul Pastorak came on board to start supporting the state, it was after the storm, and General Landreneau was well on his way with implementing his strategic vision for the recovery of the Guard, if you will.
When I was first appointed to this position, my board members told me, you need to get rid of this responsibility. You need to ask the governor, who is going to really drive your appointment, to take responsibility for the construction of schools so you can work on the academic side. So literally on day one, when I met with the governor, I asked her to take responsibility for me. She told me that her people were too busy with their own issues. The challenge I had is that in the Department of Education and in the Recovery School District, which was where the resources to rebuild these schools rested, we really didn't have any personnel. The instant need that I had at the moment was just preparing some temporary schools for the coming September. So then I realized I needed human capital. And I started with a few people in the National Guard who I knew, and they led me to General Landreneau. And I said, General, can you give me some guardsmen? If you're giving guardsmen to everybody else and you're doing all kinds of other things, how about the Department of Education? That was a pretty unprecedented request, but he said yes. So I got the National Guardsmen, and that put me on a pathway to begin to do the emergency school facilities to be in place by September. But what I quickly recognized in the first couple of weeks of taking this job, this is almost a year and a half, a little more than a year and a half after the storm, is the people in New Orleans were looking for some wins.
We began to realize that his problem was a little more complex than the National Guard's problem, in that gaining ground truth or situational awareness of where he was almost his first step.
And I originally started out very early on in this job saying if we could just build one brand new school for the ground up, it would show people in the city of New Orleans that there was some hope. When I reached out to General Landreneau, Colonel Mouton, and others in the National Guard, I said, you know, help me figure out where I'd put one school. And then they said, well, you really need to have a plan. And I said, okay, I'll bite. How would I do that? Well, we just finished a planning process for Jackson Barracks. Why don't we use the same planning process? I said it's got to be quick, it's got to be soon, and I got to have some real meat come out of it.
What we suggested was, hey, let's just take 3 days and bring all the stakeholders into the same room and really take inventory on exactly where we are.
We did. Within about 30 days, we sat down, we designed how we would build some new schools. In fact, I was thinking 1, but we expanded it to 3 and later to 5. But then we said, okay, we can't just build them willy-nilly. We have to have a plan for the whole piece. So in that session, we laid down the big ideas for how we would go about doing this, knowing we would have to have a much more detailed master planning process. But General Landreneau and I exchanged the big picture planning. He was ahead of me on his work at Jackson Barracks, and so he was guiding me, and I was looking for guidance.
I can remember walking on the parade field with the Secretary of the Army, and he looked around this magnificent facility, although we were looking at devastation and destruction. He looked at the historic buildings and he said, you know, this is a piece of American history that needs to be maintained. And I will go back to Washington and do everything I can to allow you to rebuild this facility. We got huge support from the Department of Army, from the National Guard Bureau, and from the Congress.
Well, the Guard program relative to funding, you know, they come from a culture of planners and contingency operators, so we had built a pretty lockstep, short-term, interim, long-term plan to affect the recovery and to tie the resource requirements to that pretty cleanly.
But the real big problem we had was we didn't really have any significant money.
Paul Pastrak, on the other hand, had a much bigger challenge. He had to go through the process of adjudication with FEMA and to not only take what they were offering him, but make the case as to why he needed more resources, why his plan required a more robust response. And he was operating against a backdrop that had no precedence.
So you can't build something unless you had cash flow. We had no cash flow. I didn't have anything. I had no line of credit. I had no money, no nothing. So we had to come out with an arrangement with FEMA so that, and the contractor and the designer, so that the contractor would trust us enough that they would put their invoice in and that FEMA would pay that invoice on time, and that then we would put another invoice out and FEMA would pay it. They were my bank, but there were all kinds of issues around that banking process.
So while DOD deals in large numbers, for them to come up with $480 million out of 1 year's appropriations was not alien territory. But for FEMA to turn around and dedicate over $1 billion to one single agency's recovery was just new ground altogether.
And we finally got FEMA to think about how they reimbursed us in a different way so that we could actually expedite this construction. And we did create a totally new paradigm for FEMA, which they began to use with other agencies, and then ultimately they're now using it nationally.
I think both programs are great examples of strategic leadership and really outstanding outcomes.
But when you look back at the master plan that the team spent a lot of time developing, I have to tell you that it put us on a track that brought us to where we are today, and our vision didn't change.
The big picture when we started this was we were going to put every child in a world-class school, and that continues to be the vision. And what we have to do now is, as a community, agree that we like world-class schools. We must have world-class schools. And if we can give them world-class education in world-class school buildings, they'll want more of it.
I think the real lesson that we came away with in a post-disaster environment is we have to exploit our unique training as planners and architects to help our clients solve the larger, more intellectual problems they face in terms of where am I? What do I look like today? Is this how I want to look in the future? And without any constraints, how do I want to be deep into the future? And giving them the freedom to think that way, and then looking at what resources we can put in place to come up with a really methodical plan to get there. That's the story of the RSD in the National Guard, two leaders that took on that challenge and created phenomenal results.